Hired only to cook for 6 motherless girls and their quiet rancher father, Clara intended to stay just long enough to earn her keep. But the youngest called her Mama before the week was through. Clara didn't wait for the man to speak. She stepped down from the wagon the moment the reins were dropped, her carpetbag bumping against her knees, boots hitting the dirt with a firmness that hadn't been in her spirit for years. It was the middle child, Eliza, who noticed her first, peeking from behind a post with a smudge of blackberry on her chin and eyes too large for her small face. Clara lifted a hand in half salute, but Eliza ducked out of sight again like a groundhog to its hole. A man's boot steps sounded behind the post as he rounded the corner of the porch. He was tall, too tall for the hat he wore, and broader than any man Clara had met in 2 years of travel since George's death. She waited for him to speak, but he only nodded once, eyes not on her, but on the bag she'd placed at her feet. "Name's Clara Weaver," she said quickly. "Widowed 2 years this fall. I cook, I clean. I don't tolerate sass or laziness. You said 6 girls. I brought extra flour." His eyes flicked to her then. Just a glance, but something registered. Recognition, maybe. Not of her face, but of the type of woman she was. Worn at the edges, stitched back together too many times. And still upright. He held out a hand. "Matthew Langley," he said, voice rough like bark stripped from pine. "The house is that way." He gestured toward a sprawling timber home behind the barn, porch sagging a little at the far end. "You'll have the room at the back, past the pantry. Girls sleep in the loft. I sleep on the porch most nights." Clara didn't ask why. She only nodded, adjusted her grip on the bag, and started walking. Inside, the house bore the same wear as the man and the land. A table scarred with years of children's elbows, spoons, and lesson slates. A set of boots by the door, 6 sizes too small for a man, arranged in a crooked line, and the smell of burnt flour and milk gone sour. "I'll make supper," she said without waiting to be asked. "Don't bother," came a sharp voice from the stairs. It was the eldest, Bethany, she would learn later, arms crossed tight, her jaw too stubborn for 10 years old. "We ain't hungry." Clara didn't answer. She set her bag down, rolled up her sleeves, and headed for the root cellar. By dusk, the scent of real food filled the house, stew thick with herbs, bread rising in the heat of the stone hearth, and wild honey drizzled into tea for little ones who didn't ask for it but drank all the same. None of them spoke during the meal. The man sat at the far end of the table, knife sliding through bread crust in measured rhythm. The girls glanced, between him and Clara, as if unsure what lines were still drawn. It was just as Clara wiped her hands and began to clear the dishes when it happened, a tug at her skirt. She looked down. The youngest, Addie, stood blinking up at her, fingers curled into the hem of Clara's apron. She had curls the color of butter left out too long and a voice like wind between shudders. "Are you my mama? Now?" she asked. The words silenced every scrape of fork and clink of spoon in the room. Clara's breath caught in her throat, too full of memory and ache to answer. Her gaze flicked to Matthew, but he looked away. I just cook and clean, sweetheart," Clara whispered. "Nothing more." But Addie only nodded, as if she'd heard something else entirely, and went back to her seat without another word. That night, Clara lay in the small back room with her hands folded tight, trying not to remember the child she'd buried before she ever saw her first birthday. The silence of the house creaked around her, but somewhere in the darkness the floorboards shifted. A whisper of feet, then the softest knock against her door. "Ma'am?" It was Eliza again. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and opened the door. The little girl stood there with a candle cupped in her hands. "I heard a coyote," she murmured. "Can I just stay here for a bit?" Clara didn't speak. She stepped aside, and Eliza climbed into the little cot without another sound. She would wake later to find another child, then another, curled against her legs and sides one by one, having braved the creaks of the floor just to be near her. When the sun rose, Clara's bed would be full, the room filled with the soft breaths of 6 little girls. And Matthew would notice. He stood outside the room just past dawn, arms crossed, hat in hand, eyes dark. Clara emerged rubbing her eyes, trying not to show how deeply she'd slept for the first time in years. "They all came to me," she said quietly. "I didn't ask them." "I know," he said after a pause. He didn't smile, but his gaze softened. Just slightly. Enough. The days followed like a breathless wind. Clara didn't ask where their mother had gone, and none of the girls told her. Not even when she cleaned out a cupboard to find a single ribbon, still perfumed faintly with lavender and smoke. Not even when she spotted Bethany, the eldest, sitting outside with her mother's old shoes in her lap, polishing them, though. They hadn't fit her since spring, but grief leaves traces, and a mother's absence is a space too wide to fill. Clara didn't try to fill it. She just made sure there was food on the table, stitches in every hem, and a warm hand brushing back hair from fevered foreheads when the night chills set in. And slowly, one by one, they changed. Mary, who hadn't spoken above a whisper in weeks, began, humming while helping knead the dough. Lottie, the second youngest, no longer cried when the wind rattled the windows at night. Even Bethany stopped glaring at her, and once, while walking past the pantry, Clara heard the girl mutter to herself, "She doesn't even smell like ashes." Whatever that meant, it settled like a stone in Clara's chest. The real shift came. With the fence, a storm rolled through, tearing half the post line down. Matthew and the eldest boy from the next ranch worked from sunup, patching it back together. Clara brought biscuits out in a pail and found him standing there, shoulders sagging, palms bleeding from the rope. "Let me," she said, grabbing the hammer before he could object. He didn't stop her. They worked in silence until the sky began to darken again. The last nail drove home just as the first drop fell. And that was when it happened. From the house came Addie's voice, tiny and sharp, carried by the wind. "You fixed our fence. Could you fix Mama's heart too?" The hammer dropped from Clara's hand. Matthew froze, and the rain started falling. Matthew didn't turn around. The hammer lay forgotten in the dirt by his boots, and Clara stood still, palms damp from work and rain. Her breath held as though even exhaling might shatter the moment. Addie's voice was gone as fast as it had come, carried off by the rising wind, but it echoed between them like a bell in a cold church. Clara stooped, picked up the hammer, and offered it back to him. He didn't take it. "I'll get supper started," she said gently. Matthew finally met her eyes, his own guarded, but not hard. "I'll finish here," he said after a moment. The walk back to the house felt longer than it had the first night. The sky broke open before she reached the porch, and by the time she stepped inside, she was soaked to her bones. The girls rushed around her, bringing towels, pulling her toward the hearth, each one talking over the other. It wasn't until she had dried her hair and set the kettle back on that she realized they had formed a ring around her without planning it. One girl perched on the arm of the chair, another draped across the rug, 2 more settled against her, knees. Bethany stood in the doorway, arms crossed again, but her voice had lost its edge. "You didn't even flinch when she said that." "I heard," Clara replied softly. "She says things like that sometimes," Bethany continued. "Mama, stuff. It hurts." Clara nodded. "Yes, it does. You gonna stay?" The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't even challenging. It was just tired. So much older than 10. Clara's answer came after a silence that wrapped around the room like a warm blanket. "I don't plan to leave." Bethany looked at her sisters, then back to Clara. "Good," she said. "We're tired of women who leave." The door creaked behind them as Matthew stepped inside, water streaming from his coat. His eyes swept the room, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, his shoulders didn't look so weighed down. "Storm's not done," he said, "but the fence'll hold." Clara rose from the chair and moved to the stove. "Supper in 10. He nodded, brushed the water from his sleeves, and disappeared into his room. That night the storm howled louder. The wind screamed down the chimney, and thunder cracked like a tree splitting down the middle. Lottie screamed from her loft bed, and Clara was already up the ladder before Matthew's feet hit the floorboards. "It's all right," she soothed, gathering the little girl against her chest. "It's just noise, just the sky stomping its boots." "Is it mad?" Lottie whimpered. "Is the sky mad again?" "No, sweetheart, just loud. Loud don't mean angry." The other girls began to stir, and Clara lay down across the floorboards of the loft, letting the children gather around her like kittens to a warm stove. One by one, their breathing slowed, the storm rolled past, and peace settled back into the wood. Matthew didn't return to his room. She heard his footsteps pause, then recede toward the porch. She didn't follow. She didn't sleep, either. 3 days passed before he spoke to her with any kind of depth. They were in the barn, tending to a goat that had a gash on its flank. Clara held the animal still while Matthew stitched, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man who'd once split logs without gloves all winter. "You been around animals much?" he asked quietly. "I grew up on a farm." "Then you know how they get skittish when something's off." Clara nodded. "The girls, they're like that." She looked at him. After their mama passed, they didn't say a word for nearly 2 weeks. Then they started acting up. Wild. Like colts that had been spooked too bad. I didn't know what to do. Still don't. You kept them fed. You stayed. I stay because I don't know how to do anything else. That's more than most would. He tied the last stitch and stood. "That little one, the one who called you Mama, the first day, she's barely 5. She was with her when she died." Clara's heart clenched. "Found her curled up beside her in bed. Took me hours to get her to let go." They stood in silence for a while after that. The wind outside the barn had quieted, and the goats settled into their pens. Matthew glanced toward the house. "I don't know what you're doing to them," he said, "but whatever it is, they're sleeping through the night again." "I'm not doing anything," Clara replied. "Just showing up. Then maybe that's what they needed all along." On Sunday, they walked the 4 miles to the church on the ridge. Clara packed biscuits and dried peaches. The girls wore mismatched dresses, hair tied up in varying states of order. Matthew walked behind, hat low, steps steady. Clara hadn't stepped inside a church since the funeral. Her knees buckled when she entered, but she forced herself forward. The girls filed into the pew with practiced ease, Clara beside them, Matthew settling in at the edge like he might bolt. The pastor was a thin man with kind eyes who noticed the newcomers but didn't make a fuss. The sermon was on restoration, about how broken things could be mended, not made new, but made strong in the places they'd been cracked. Clara found her throat tight halfway through. When she looked over, she saw Bethany had slipped her hand into Addie's. After the service, the girls ran outside to chase each other under the sun. Matthew lingered at the doorway while Clara stood beside him, the warmth of the sun only half of what filled her chest. "You used to come here?" he asked. "With my husband, before he passed." "He was a church man?" "No," she said, smiling faintly. "But he liked the singing." Matthew didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth lifted. "I reckon I can understand that." They stood in silence again until Addie came barreling toward them with wild hair and dirt on her chin. "I found a feather," she shouted, holding it up like a treasure. "A real dove feather." Clara crouched. "Then you better keep it safe." "It's for you," she said, jamming it into Clara's hand. "To keep your heart soft." Clara blinked. "Who told? You, my heart was hard." Addie shrugged. "Nobody. I just think it's a little sad. but better now. Matthew watched as Clara tucked the feather into her prayer book, then met her gaze with a look that didn't need words. They walked home, slower than they came. 2 days later, Clara found Bethany outside with a ragged doll, sewing its head back, on with thread she'd stolen from the pantry. She didn't say a word as Clara sat beside her. "Her name's Juniper," Bethany muttered. "Mama made her before she got sick. She's lovely. She's been headless since the night Mama died." Clara placed her hand gently over the girl's. "Some things take time to fix," she said. Bethany's lip trembled. "What if they don't get fixed? Then we hold the pieces." The next morning, there were 2 biscuits left on Clara's windowsill, shaped like hearts, lumpy, burnt at the edges, but perfect. The house began to change. It wasn't sudden. There were no grand declarations or shifts of furniture, no ceremonial turning of a page. It was the small things first. The way Bethany stopped retreating to the woodshed after chores. The way Rosie began humming again when she set the table. How Addie, once the wildest of them all, now checked the windows for Clara when the sky dimmed, always waiting for her to come back in from the well. And Clara, though careful, though cautious, began to rearrange herself too. She no longer asked before baking 2 loaves of bread instead of 1. She didn't check to see if Matthew approved when she scrubbed the floorboards on hands and knees with soap made from lavender and pine resin. She started folding the girls' dresses without being asked and began writing their names, by memory, on little cloth tags so they wouldn't fight over whose was whose. And Matthew, he stayed mostly quiet, but his silence was not cold like it had been. He began leaving his tools where she could reach them, not locked up in the barn. He fixed the crooked stair she'd stubbed her toe on without her saying a word. One morning, without looking at her, he poured her coffee first and handed it over without a sound. It was stronger than she liked, but she drank it anyway. He noticed. The next morning, it was weaker, and he didn't say anything, but he handed it over again. That small courtesy was a sentence in a book they'd both forgotten how to read. It was 2 weeks after that Sunday service when Clara began noticing what had truly changed. Addie had taken to dragging her blanket behind her like a pup, always ending up curled against Clara's side before breakfast. Rosie, the second youngest, had started mimicking Clara's words. "Mind your feet, dear," and "That's enough jam for now," and "Elbows off the table." Bethany, still the stormiest of the 6, sat closer during meals now and had taken it upon herself to braid her sister's hair, whispering they ought to look proper for Miss Clara, though she pretended not to care when Clara noticed. One afternoon, as Clara kneaded dough with flour in her hair and sleeves rolled up, she caught the eldest girl, Hannah, watching her through the kitchen door. "You all right, sugar?" Clara asked without pausing her work. Hannah hesitated, then stepped into the kitchen. She looked down at her hands, twisting a hem into knots. "I want to learn how." "To knead?" "To make bread, like Mama used to." Clara's hands stilled. "You sure?" The girl nodded, her cheeks a furious pink. "I've been smelling it every morning, and I just want to remember how it felt." Clara pushed the extra dough toward her. "Then let's get your hands messy." And they did. Flour on the floor, half a bowl wasted, and dough under fingernails. But Hannah didn't leave her side the whole time. Later that evening, when Matthew came in and smelled the bread, he paused in the doorway and looked at his eldest with something like pride that hurt just to witness. "You teach her that?" he asked Clara. "She already knew," Clara replied. "Just needed reminding." Later that week, Clara stayed up late sewing in the lamplight. The dresses were beginning to fall apart at the hems, and she'd quietly taken up mending them during her own time. 1, 2, 3 in a row, she patched and hemmed. By the 4th, her back ached and the fire was low. A shadow shifted behind her. She turned, startled. Matthew stood there in the dim, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "Didn't mean to frighten you," he said. "You didn't. Just startled is all." He stepped closer, just enough to let the light catch his face. "You don't have to do that." "I know. You're not being paid for mending. I know that, too. You're doing more than cooking." Clara set down the needle, slow and careful. They needed more than food. He nodded, but the silence between them deepened. Finally he said, "My wife, Elena, she used to do the same. Sew in the dark until her eyes stung. I'd tell her to stop, and she'd smile like I didn't understand a thing." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "Maybe you didn't. Maybe not." He turned to go, then paused. "She'd have liked you." Clara looked down at her sewing, heart thudding. "Thank you," she whispered, but he was already gone. The girls began calling her Mama when they forgot. At first it was accidental, little slips of the tongue in the morning rush. "Mama, I mean, Miss Clara, can I have more?" Or, "Mama, Rosie took my, oh, sorry." Each time the air shifted. Each time Clara would pause, meet their eyes, and say nothing, just offer a small smile or a gentle nod, but they kept doing it, and she stopped correcting them. Matthew never said a word about it, never frowned, never looked away. But once, after dinner, when Addie said it loudly, "Mama, Hannah said I can't have a second roll." Clara turned red and hesitated, but Matthew only looked at Addie and said, "Then maybe you ask nicely, little dove." The next day he began chopping wood again, twice as much as needed. No one asked why. The first test came in the form of a knock. A man stood on the porch one dusty Tuesday, tall and lanky, with a smirk too loose and a gaze that didn't know how to mind its manners. He tipped his hat at Clara, but looked her over, too long, and when Matthew came out behind her, silent and wide-shouldered, the man laughed nervously. "Didn't mean no offense," he said. "Just passing through. Heard there was a widow cookin' for a whole passel of girls and a lone man. Figured maybe I'd offer my services in case the lady needed help." Matthew stepped onto the porch without a word, slow as molasses, but 10. "Times is dangerous. You heard wrong," he said. "I did. She ain't a widow cookin'. She's family." The man raised both hands, backed off like smoke in wind, and didn't come near again. Clara said nothing. But that night, when she brought him his supper, she lingered a second longer and gently set a folded napkin beside his plate. He didn't look up, but he whispered a thank you so low she almost thought she imagined it. Then came the second test. Sickness. Little Rosie woke shivering in the night, flushed and breathless. Clara was by her side before the second cough. A cold, they thought. Just a cold. But by morning, the cough deepened, her breathing wheezed, and her lips turned pale. Clara barked orders like she'd been born in a storm. Boil water, fetch willow bark, keep the others back. Bethany watched, white-faced, as Clara stripped the girl down, pressed rags to her burning skin, and held her upright so the wheezing didn't drown her. Matthew rode into town in a fury, returning before dusk with the doctor and more than one bottle of medicine. He paced like a madman outside the door as the girls cried in corners and Clara sat on the bed with Rosie in her arms, whispering prayers between cool cloths and shivering sighs. "She's strong," Clara told them. "She's going to be all right." And Rosie was. It took 4 days, but the fever broke. When Rosie finally opened her eyes and asked for a biscuit, Clara cried into the sheets and didn't bother pretending she hadn't. That night, the girls wrapped around her like roots to a tree, and that was the first night Matthew said the word out loud. "Mama," he said, standing in the doorway. "She called you Mama just now." Clara nodded. "She did." Matthew looked at her, truly looked at her, the weariness and sorrow in his face slowly giving way to something softer. "You all right with that?" Clara blinked through her tears. "More than all right." He left the doorway. But in the morning there was a small bouquet of wildflowers on the kitchen table, picked fresh, bound with string. No one confessed to placing them there. The world after Rosie's fever was different, not in any loud or definite way, but in how the walls of the house seemed to breathe easier, how the laughter returned without being tugged. Even the rooster crowed less like a battle cry and more like a hymn. Clara began singing again. She hadn't noticed she'd stopped, but the morning after Rosie took her first steps out of bed, Clara found herself humming as she peeled potatoes. Nothing fancy, just a gentle tune her mother once sang, and soon Addie had picked it up from the floorboards, twirling in slow circles in the doorway. Bethany, hands on her hips, whispered, "She's never danced before." And Clara, smiling at the bubbling pot, whispered back, "Maybe it was just never the right song." Hannah sat straighter at the table these days, and the book she once ignored began to stay open longer. Clara taught her to write recipes in neat script, and the two older girls began taking turns reading Bible verses out loud before bed, something Matthew had tried to do since his wife passed, but it always ended in half-silence and too many choked words. Now the house prayed together, and Clara wasn't just leading the prayers. She was being prayed for. Matthew said her name out loud in grace for the first time one evening. The stew was still steaming, and all 6 girls sat with hands joined. When Matthew bowed his head and spoke slowly, "Thank you, Lord, for this meal, and for the hands that made it, for Clara, who brings light to this table and steadies what was once so close to breaking." None of the girls lifted their heads, but Clara's heart did. And that night, once the house was still and her lamp dimmed low, she knelt beside her cot and cried. Not from sorrow, not quite from joy either, but from the release of something clenched inside her for years. She had come to cook, but the Lord had placed her in the middle of a family desperate to be whole again. There was a letter. It arrived 3 weeks later, sealed with the smudge of a hurried postmark. Clara found it atop the porch rail before breakfast and knew it before she read the name. The script was too neat, the ink too fresh. It was from Raymond, her late husband's brother, the one who had written only once since the funeral, the one who hadn't shown up to help with the debt, the burial, the groceries, or the silence that followed every breath she took after being made a widow. The letter said he was moving west, said he'd heard she'd taken up work with a widower and 6 children, said maybe it was time they spoke again, that they could start over. He signed it with the same name he always used, Ray. No love, no apology, no mention of the 7 years. She'd spent grieving with no one knocking on her door. She folded the letter in half, slow and quiet, and put it inside her apron pocket. She didn't mention it to Matthew. Not that day, not the next, but it sat like a stone inside her apron, shifting heavier each time she laid it down at night. It was Hannah who brought it up first. She'd been reading on the porch with Bethany, both girls leaning shoulder to shoulder, when Clara came out to brush off the rugs. The breeze caught the edge of the letter in her pocket, and Hannah's sharp eyes caught the edge of a name. "That for you?" she asked. Clara paused. "It is." "From family?" "No," Clara said after a moment. "Not anymore." Bethany didn't ask, but Hannah did. "You gonna answer it?" Clara didn't meet her eyes. "I don't know." Hannah said nothing, but Clara could feel the weight of her watching even after she turned back to her book. It wasn't the letter that changed things. It was the silence Clara wrapped around it. Matthew noticed. Of course he did. He'd spent the last month watching her every gesture like a man reading scripture for the first time in years. So, when her laugh came softer, her walk a little slower, he asked. He didn't press, just waited until the girls were asleep, until the lamp on the porch flickered low, and said, "You seem far away." Clara, sitting across from him with a quilt over her lap, didn't lie. There was a letter, from someone who didn't bother until now. He nodded. Someone you used to know well? Someone I used to think would have buried me right next to my husband. Now he writes like I was a stranger who moved away. Matthew stirred the last of his coffee. You planning to go see him? I don't know. You'd tell me if you were. I'm telling you now. Silence. Then, softly, you've already built something here. The girls love you. Clara looked out toward the dark field, where fireflies blinked like lanterns lost in fog. I didn't come here looking for love. And I didn't hire you for it, Matthew said. But there it is. Clara's breath caught. You think I'd leave? I don't want to think about it at all. And when their eyes met, in the hush of that quiet porch, the air between them felt thin as paper and 10 times more fragile. The storm came that Saturday. Wind tore down from the hills, like it was hunting the trees themselves. The youngest girls screamed when the barn doors flew open and hay scattered across the yard like confetti. Matthew ran out in the rain with a rope, and Clara, despite his shouting, followed. Together, drenched, gripping the frame of the barn, against the screaming sky, they tied the doors shut with a knot she'd learned back when she was married. They didn't speak a word till the rain let up, till they stood panting, soaked to the skin, mud up to their knees. Clara looked up at him, hair stuck to her face, and said through a gasp, "Maybe next time I'll let you do the running." Matthew shook the water from his beard, then met her eyes. "Next time? I just meant—" But his hand reached out, trembling slightly, and touched her face, brushing back a strand of hair with a gentleness that broke her completely. "Stay," he said, the word barely a breath. "Just stay." She stepped closer, trembling too, and let her forehead rest against his chest. The storm outside had passed, but a new one had started inside her heart. The letter stayed unanswered. Weeks passed. She never sent a word back. Raymond could find someone else to write his name beside. She already had 6 souls whispering "Mama" when they were half asleep, 6 pairs of arms wrapping around her waist when they needed warmth, 6 little hearts building a home around her presence. She had Matthew, too, though neither of them said it. Not yet. It didn't have to be said. One morning, Clara woke to find something placed beside the stove, a stack of paper, ink, and a wooden box with a brass latch. Inside the box was a hand-carved spoon. Its handle had her name on it. Below, the name, etched so gently it took the right light to read it, was one more word. Family. She brought the box to the table in silence, eyes stinging, and placed it before the girls. Addie leaned over it, giggling. "Mama, that's your name," Rosie clapped. "It's your spoon, your very own spoon." Clara touched the wood and whispered, "It's more than that." Bethany met her eyes and said, clear as the sun, "It's yours, 'cause you're ours." Matthew walked in then, boots still dusty from morning chores. He didn't say a word, just smiled, soft, true, and tipped his hat. The day Clara started sewing dresses from leftover flour sacks, Matthew watched her from the doorway of the washroom like he might start weeping just from the sight of it. Had gathered the girls around her in a half-circle on the rug, each one with a scrap of fabric in her lap and a needle she'd patiently shown them how to thread. Rosie was too little to do much more than tangle herself in string, but Clara let her pretend, cooing every time the child made a wild loop. Bethany, ever the precise one, was already mimicking Clara's stitches with the concentration of a woman. Twice her age. "You're making something out of nothing," Matthew had said later, while helping carry in firewood. "Again." Clara chuckled but didn't meet his eyes. "That's what mothers do." He paused then, letting the full weight of those words fill the air between them. Clara hadn't meant to say it, not like that. It had just come out, honest and unguarded, the way things had been coming out more and more around Matthew these days. And instead of stepping back from it, Matthew stepped forward. "Then you are one." He said it like a truth he'd already lived with for weeks. And Clara, blinking, tried to pretend she didn't feel every thread of her soul tighten around the sound of it. A week later, Addie fell from the rope swing. It was a bad fall. Clara heard the scream before she saw the others racing across the yard, arms flailing, feet tripping in the grass. Addie lay twisted at the base of the tree, clutching her arm and sobbing in gasps that made Clara's own ribs ache. She dropped to her knees beside the girl and pulled her into her lap. Matthew was already running for the wagon. They made it to the doctor in just under an hour, the road rough, the wagon wheels leaping from stone to stone. Clara held Addie the entire ride, whispering prayers and songs between the girl's little gasps. Her arm was broken, the doctor confirmed, but clean, no complications. She'll need to be gentle with it, he told Matthew. No rope swings for a while. Clara nodded, brushing Addie's sweat-damp curls from her brow. I'll make sure. And when Addie whimpered, I want Mama. It didn't even occur to anyone. Not the doctor, not Matthew, not even Addie. Herself, that she didn't mean someone else. The house shifted again. Subtle, but sure. Addie began calling Clara Mama every time she needed something. Milk, a hug, a gentle tucking in at night. Rosie, seeing the pattern, mimicked her sister, and soon the smallest voices in the house were always crying out, Mama, 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 like they'd never known any other way. Clara should have corrected them, but she didn't. She couldn't. Bethany was more cautious. She didn't say it out loud, not at first. But one evening, after dinner, she handed Clara a folded piece of paper with a drawing on it. 6 stick-figure girls holding hands with a taller figure in the middle. On the top, in shaky handwriting, it read, Me and my sisters with our mama. Clara traced the letters with her thumb and kissed the top of Bethany's head. No words. Just warmth. Then came the Sunday. Matthew stood beside her in church. They'd gone before, always with the girls, but this time he didn't sit at the end of the pew like he used to. He sat beside her, close. So close his elbow brushed hers every time he turned a page in the hymnal. When the preacher spoke of the Lord rebuilding what's been torn down, Clara felt Matthew's breath catch beside her. Afterward, while the girls chased each other around the wagon, a neighbor woman approached. I heard you took on a housekeeper, she said to Matthew, smiling too sweet, eyes glancing Clara up and down. I didn't, he said. Clara blinked, confused. The woman blinked too. Matthew turned to Clara, his hand suddenly brushing the small of her back. I took in a mother. The neighbor's smile faded. Matthew didn't seem to notice or care. He guided Clara to the wagon like nothing had passed between them at all, but her heart burned so fiercely in her chest that she sat silent the whole ride home, afraid that speaking might shatter whatever fragile joy had just taken root. There was only one person left to say it. Hannah. She'd been watching the others for weeks, silent but observant, always just on the edge of things. Clara knew the girl was guarding her heart, knew she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone else to leave again. Clara didn't push. She waited, until the night a thunderstorm cracked through the sky like a whip and sent all the younger girls scrambling into bed together. Clara went from room to room, tucking them in, singing softly over Rosie's wide eyes and smoothing Addie's curls where she clutched her sling like it was a shield. Last was Hannah's room. The girl was sitting. Up, arms crossed, jaw tight. Storm won't hurt you, Clara said gently. Hannah didn't look at her. Storms always take something. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. What did the last one take? My mama, Hannah whispered. Fever hit during a storm. I always thought, maybe if the weather had been different. Her voice broke, and Clara reached for her hand, holding it firm. I can't replace her, she said softly, but I can stay. Hannah looked at her then, eyes wide and wet. Even if I don't call you Mama?" Clara nodded. Even then, Hannah's lip trembled. She whispered, "But I think I want to." Clara pulled her close and held her through the thunder and the rain and the long, quiet after. Spring pushed its way in like a slow bloom. The frost receded. The creek thawed, and Clara's hands began to plant things again: basil, carrots, peas, and hope. The girls took turns helping, each one more committed than the last. Matthew dug 2 new raised beds out behind the barn and said, "Thought we might need more room this year." Clara smiled at him. "You expecting a second harvest?" "I'm expecting this family to stay full." He said it without blinking. She felt her knees go weak and steadied herself on the hoe. That night, he didn't sleep. He waited until the moon was high and the last lantern snuffed, and then he stood outside her door. He didn't knock, just breathed in long and slow and whispered, "Clara?" She opened the door already dressed, hair braided, hands clasped. "I thought maybe you'd come." He looked down at her hands, then back at her face. "I have something I need to say." She nodded. "Lost my wife, but I didn't lose my heart. Neither did I. I thought love ended with death. So did I." He stepped closer, took her hands in his. "I was wrong." Clara's breath caught. Matthew held out a ring. Not new. Old. Worn. Probably his mother's. Not to replace anyone, but to choose someone. Clara stared at it, then at him, then whispered, "Yes." He placed it on her finger like it had always belonged there. The next morning, 6 little girls woke to the sound of Clara's laughter rising through the house like sunlight, and when they came running, tumbling, squealing into the kitchen, Rosie saw the ring first. She screamed so loud she startled the chickens. Bethany just smiled. "You're really our mama now." Clara scooped them all into her arms. Always was. The wedding was simple, almost accidental, and it fit them better than any grand affair might have. Matthew and Clara stood under the blooming crabapple tree behind the house, its white petals falling like a quiet blessing, and the girls wore matching blue dresses Clara had stitched from old curtains and leftover cotton. The preacher was the same man who had baptized Rosie last year, and he brought along his wife to play the fiddle softly through the vows. There were no guests besides the 6 girls. There didn't need to be. Hannah handed over the ring, after. A solemn moment of almost dropping it, and Rosie stuffed flowers into Matthew's vest pocket like it was a game. Bethany cried so hard Clara had to hold her hand through the whole ceremony, and Matthew kissed each girl on the forehead before he finally turned to Clara. Hands steady, eyes clearer than she'd ever seen them. "I promise," he said, "to keep this house steady, and you, always you, safe." Clara didn't try to hold her tears back. "And I promise to love these girls as my own, and you, well, as if I'd been waiting my whole life." And maybe she had. The first kiss was short, gentle, but the girls shrieked loud enough to wake. The Hills, and by sundown, the new family sat around the table, eating stew and cornbread and raspberry pie like it was Christmas. But even in joy, life doesn't pause. Just 2 days after the wedding, a knock came at the door, hard, businesslike. Matthew opened it with Clara just behind him. Sheriff Denham stood there, hat in hand, a grave look on his face. "Sorry to interrupt your new start." "Matthew, but you've been named in a property dispute." Matthew frowned. "Over what?" Denham hesitated. "Your late wife's cousin, Martin. He's claiming your land was deeded improperly. He says your wife inherited it, not you. Now he's saying it should have passed to her kin, not her husband." Matthew went still. "That land's been mine since I was 17. He has some papers, and a lawyer from back east." The girls had clustered in the doorway, listening. Clara moved quickly, ushering them away, but Hannah stayed. "They're not going to take our house," she said, voice flat. Clara didn't answer. Not yet. The next few weeks unraveled the quiet. Peace they'd only just sewn together. Matthew traveled back and forth to town, speaking to a lawyer friend, gathering deeds, affidavits, testimonies. The girls noticed his absence. Clara filled the gap as best she could, she always did, but there was a tension now in the walls, a fear she could feel in every late-night whisper the girls shared under quilts. She'd come to love the sound of their giggles echoing through the wood boards. Now those sounds were quieter, heavier. And through it all, Clara fought the feeling in her chest that whispered, "If they take the land, where do we go?" Then, one night while cleaning out a drawer looking for birth certificates, anything to strengthen, the claim, Matthew found something else, something forgotten, a letter, unopened. He brought it to Clara in the kitchen. "It's from Ruth," he said, voice rough, "from a year before she passed." Clara took it gently, opened the envelope, and read aloud. "Dearest Matthew, if you're reading this, I've probably gone. I've tried not to worry you with my thoughts, but I want things in order. That land, your land, was always yours. I know what it meant to you. I never wanted anyone else laying a hand on it, so I'm signing this to put it in writing. I don't trust my cousin Martin. I always had a feeling he'd come sniffing around. I want you to have peace, for the girls to grow up where they belong. And maybe, someday, you won't be alone out there. I hope someone good finds you, someone kind, someone who sees you for the man you are. Love, Ruth." The letter was dated, signed, witnessed by a neighbor woman in the valley. Clara clutched it to her chest. This saves everything. The lawyer confirmed it. The document would hold. The challenge collapsed within days, and Martin left town grumbling threats no one paid any mind to. The house stayed theirs. The fields stayed theirs. The creek, the garden, the future, it all settled again under their feet like firm ground after a long storm. That night, Clara knelt at her bedside, all 6 girls already asleep, and whispered a prayer not of begging, but of thanks, for land, for love, for second chances. But something changed in Clara. Victory didn't come without cost. Seeing how quickly everything could be threatened, taken, had stirred something deep in her. She began keeping a small ledger in the back of her recipe book, noting every dollar spent, every quart of jam sold, every egg bartered. Matthew noticed, of course. "You think we'll need to fight again?" he asked one night, leaning against the porch rail. "I think I want to be ready." Matthew didn't argue. He simply took her hand and said, "Then I'll build you a better pantry." She laughed, but 2 days later he did just that, and built new coops too. Clara took to drying herbs by the window, and the girls each planted their own row of flowers. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was legacy. Then, one morning, a letter arrived, this time addressed to Clara. She opened it slowly, recognizing the handwriting from a time she thought long buried. It was from Samuel's sister, her late husband's only family. The letter was brief. Samuel had passed. Years ago, it turned out, not long after abandoning her. But there, in careful ink, was one sentence that wouldn't leave her thoughts for days. "He never stopped regretting what he did to you. I thought you should know." She said nothing of the letter to the girls. Not at first, but that night she handed it to Matthew, who read it silently, then gave it back. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm better than all right," she said. "I just didn't expect the door to close so softly." Matthew nodded. "You deserve soft doors." They went to bed early that night, and for the first time in a long, long time, Clara didn't dream of what she'd lost. She only dreamed of what she'd found. Then came the sickness. Rosy, first, a cough, a fever, flushed cheeks that wouldn't, cool with cloths soaked in mint tea or vinegar. Then Addie. Then Bethany. Clara didn't sleep. She moved from room to room, watching over their beds, spooning broth between lips that barely stirred. Matthew fetched the doctor. Twice. The second time, the man pulled Clara aside. "This kind of fever, it's running through the valley. You're doing everything right. But it's in God's hands now." Clara nodded. She didn't cry. She went back inside, bathed their foreheads, hummed the hymn her mother once sang over her when she was sick with measles. By the third day, Bethany stirred and asked for water. Clara gave her a whole cup and kissed her brow. Addie followed the next morning. Rosie, tiny Rosie, fought longest. But on the 6th night, her fever broke. She opened her eyes and whispered, "Mama." Clara sobbed. "I'm here." After that, the house was quieter again. Not because there was less life, but because every breath felt like a miracle. Hannah, always the watcher, drew a picture the following week of the whole family under a tree. She added halos to the sick girls, and gave Clara a crown of sunflowers. "She's the queen," Rosie said, clapping her hands. "No," said Bethany, thoughtful. "She's the roots." Matthew hung the picture over the hearth. "It's not perfect," Hannah mumbled. "No," he said. "It's better. It's ours." And it was. Spring folded itself into summer like a hymn sliding into its last sweet verse. The days stretched long and warm, and the house that had once echoed with ache now breathed with the noise of living. Bare feet on floorboards, squeals through the fields, soft voices calling out for supper as the sky pinked at dusk. Clara stood at the sink one morning, washing the last of the breakfast plates, when Rosie tugged at her dress and asked, in that open-hearted way only a 5-year-old could, "Were you always ours, Mama?" Clara blinked, her hands stilled in the dishwater. "No, sweet girl, not always." Rosie frowned like that couldn't possibly be true. "But I always wanted you," Clara said, "and I think God always meant it to end this way." That answer seemed good enough because Rosie grinned and ran back outside, arms wide like she might fly. It had been nearly a year since Clara first arrived. A year since she'd stepped through the door and offered her hands to a man with tired eyes and 6 little girls with hungering hearts. She no longer wore the dark dresses of mourning. She didn't flinch when someone said her name. And she didn't tuck herself into corners like a visitor. No one called her the cook anymore. Not even Matthew. Especially not Matthew. He called her Clara and sometimes my wife. And, when the girls weren't looking, he'd touch the small of her back like he couldn't believe she was still real. Their marriage, while simple in ceremony, had deepened in layers. It wasn't a romance born of thunder and fireworks, but one quietly built in the soft hours, over spilled flour and midnight fevers, mismatched socks and broken fences, sorrow shared and laughter traded like currency. But it wasn't perfect. Nothing living ever is. There were days when grief made Matthew quiet, and nights when Clara sat up worrying over money or a sudden cough in the girls' room. But love had settled in their home like dust on a windowsill, always there, often unnoticed until the light hit just right. One afternoon, while Matthew was mending the barn roof and the girls were down by the creek catching frogs, Clara sat on the porch with a letter in her lap. It was from her sister, Ruth, who lived in Chicago. The letter was warm and full of news. Ruth had remarried. Her boys were grown. She wanted Clara to visit. Clara read it twice. Then a third time. She folded it carefully and placed it in her apron. The thought of leaving, even for a week, felt impossible. But so did the idea of never going back, of never seeing the city streets she'd walked in her old life, of never saying goodbye to the version of herself she'd left behind. That night, she told Matthew. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask her not to go. He just said, "We'll miss you something terrible." "I haven't said yes yet," Clara replied. "But I think you will." "I might," he nodded. "Then I'll get the girls started on painting you a picture." to take with you." She laughed, but her chest tightened. 2 weeks later, Clara boarded a westbound train. Only for a week. The girls cried at the station, and Matthew held Rosie like he was afraid she'd blow away. Clara kissed each girl's forehead, squeezed Matthew's hand, and stepped onto the train with a courage she didn't fully understand. To Ewingwood, ride was long and bumpy, and the city was louder than she remembered. Ruth's house smelled of polished wood and lilac, and her sons were tall, kind young men who treated Clara like royalty. They asked about the farm, the girls, the chickens, especially the chickens for some reason, and they begged her to make the cornbread they remembered from childhood visits. She did, but her heart wasn't there. On the third night, Clara walked through the neighborhood alone. She saw the old bakery where she and Samuel had once shared bread rolls on chilly afternoons. It had changed hands 3 times since. The windows were different. The smell was gone. She didn't cry. She just turned back toward Ruth's and watched. The stars overhead, soft and foreign, like a different sky. The next morning, she packed early. Ruth tried to argue, but Clara just smiled. "My family's waiting." Back home, the girls had made a banner. "Welcome home, Mama," written in paint, and ribbons hung between 2 trees. Rosie had added hearts. Hannah had tried to draw chickens. Bethany glued dried flowers to the edges. Matthew stood beneath it, hat in hand, like he couldn't believe she'd really come back. "I brought cookies," Clara said, holding up the tin. "I brought tears," he said, pulling her into his arms. Later, that night when the girls were asleep, Clara sat beside him on the porch and asked, "Did you ever think we'd get this far?" Matthew didn't answer for a long moment. Then he said, "Every day I thought it'd fall apart." She smiled. "It didn't." No, it didn't. Fall came gently. The trees flushed gold. The mornings were crisp. Clara found herself humming as she worked. Old songs, new ones. The girls started school, and every morning was a ballet of socks, breakfast, braiding, and forgotten pencils. One night after supper, Bethany brought out a book for Clara to read aloud. The other girls gathered around, one curled under each arm, and Matthew sat in the rocking chair carving a new spoon. The story was about a brave fox who built a home out of nothing, piece by piece, with friends gathered along the way. Halfway through, Rosie looked up and said, "That's us." Clara paused. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "You're the fox," Rosie said, "and Papa is the rock, and we're the home." Matthew looked up from his carving, eyes soft. Clara smiled, pulled the girls tighter, and finished the story. The years unfolded. Winters were cold but full of laughter. Summers busy with canning, berry picking, and birthday cakes. The girls grew tall. Bethany wrote poems. Hannah sketched birds. Rosie made everyone laugh with impressions of the rooster. The younger girls followed their sisters like ducklings, and all of them called Clara Mama, like they'd never known another word. She never corrected them. Not once. Even when Bethany turned 18 and whispered, "You saved us." Even when Hannah asked, "Do you think my real mother would be proud of me?" Clara said yes, because she would. And because somewhere deep down, Clara had made herself into both, the mother who birthed them and the one who'd held them through everything that followed. One cold autumn evening, long after the girls had gone to bed, Clara and Matthew sat beside the fire. He poured them both mugs of cider, and they watched the flames curl and spit. "You think we'll be okay?" she asked, not because she doubted, but because sometimes it helped to hear. Matthew reached over, held her hand. "I know we will." There was nothing dramatic. No lightning bolt, no grand revelation. Just warmth, steady warmth, and peace. They sat there long after the fire burned low, listening to the sounds of their home, of 6 soft-breathing girls asleep upstairs, of wind tapping at the windows, of a house that had become a family. And when Matthew finally stood, offered his hand, and helped Clara up from her chair, she felt every piece of the journey settle into place like a puzzle finally whole. Some years later, a visitor came by. An old friend of the sheriff asking about boarding a niece in town. She was new, nervous, orphaned, and looking for work. She had no kin. Clara didn't hesitate. "We've always got room for one more," she said, eyes full of something deeper than kindness, something like memory. The girl was named Elsie. She cried the first night she stayed, the second night, too. But by the third, Rosie had told her a joke. Bethany shared a scarf, and Matthew built her a small desk by the window. Clara tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "You're home now," and meant it. The house grew again. The love grew again. And long after, when Clara's hair had turned silver and the porch creaked under different feet, a little plaque was nailed above the door. It read, "Where hearts are mended and families begin again." And that's exactly what it had been. The end.